My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 28 years old, and this is the story of how I slowly became a guest in the home I grew up in long before a will was ever read. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, shared calmly and honestly, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. When my father remarried, I wasn't a child anymore. I had finished college, started my first real job, and rented a modest apartment across town. I visited home often Sunday dinners, quick drop-ins after work, helping my dad with small repairs. That house was still home to me, familiar, steady. Her name was Margaret. She arrived with kindness that felt sincere at first. She asked about my job, complimented my cooking, told me how proud my father was of me. I wanted us to get along, and for a while, I believed we did. Margaret wasn't loud or demanding. She was careful, thoughtful, the kind of woman who made lists and labeled pantry shelves. She said it helped her feel settled. After my mother's death, I told myself my dad deserved someone who brought order back into the house. The changes began so quietly, I barely noticed them. One afternoon, I came by after work, the way I always had. I reached for my key and realized it didn't work anymore. Margaret opened the door a moment later, smiling politely. "Oh," she said, surprised but composed. "We just had the locks updated. Your father worries about security." She handed me a new key before I left, but added gently, "We usually like a little notice now." Notice. I agreed without thinking. It seemed reasonable. Adults give notice. I didn't want to look immature. After that, my old bedroom became the guest room. My childhood books and keepsakes were boxed and moved to the garage. Margaret said she wanted the room to feel neutral. I nodded and helped carry the boxes. Family dinners shifted too. Suddenly, they were scheduled on nights I worked late or changed at the last minute. When I arrived, Margaret would apologize kindly, explaining they'd already eaten, but I was welcome to warm something up. "You don't mind, do you?" she'd ask. Of course, I said no. I began to feel like I was always adjusting to a rhythm set without me. Decisions were made before I arrived and explained afterward as if they were already settled facts. New furniture, rearranged rooms, holiday plans. Margaret never excluded me directly. That was the unsettling part. She used language that sounded inclusive but felt oddly distant. We talked about it and thought this was best. Your father and I agreed. Our family prefers quieter holidays. Our family. Somehow I was always just outside that word. My father went along with it, not because he didn't care, but because he hated tension. After losing my mother, he wanted peace more than anything. Margaret understood that. She never argued. She simply guided. Over time, I stopped dropping by unannounced. Then I stopped staying long. I brought my own food sometimes, then stopped eating there altogether. Without realizing it, I'd learned how not to be in the way. Friends told me I was imagining things. "She sounds nice," they said. At least she's trying, and maybe she was, but kindness doesn't cancel control. It just hides it better. The first moment I truly felt like a guest came during the holidays. Margaret handed me a neatly wrapped box and said, "We thought you might like something practical." Inside was a set of guest towels. I laughed because it felt awkward not to. She smiled, satisfied. That night, as I helped my dad clean up, I noticed a folder on the kitchen counter labeled estate planning. I didn't touch it. I wasn't curious about money. But the label stayed with me. Margaret noticed my glance. "Oh, we're just being responsible," she said pleasantly. "It's important to have things organized." Organized. That word again. Lying in bed later, I replayed the small moments I'd brushed aside. The key, the room, the language. None of it was dramatic. None of it gave me a reason to confront anyone. That's what made it so effective. Displacement doesn't always come with anger. Sometimes it comes with courtesy and a smile. Sometimes it happens so slowly you don't realize you've stepped out of your own place. I didn't know it then, but Margaret wasn't just rearranging the house. She was rearranging roles. And every small adjustment was preparing us for something much bigger, something that would finally make it impossible to pretend I was still just a daughter visiting home. The will would eventually be read. And when it was, I would finally understand that being treated like a guest was never an accident. It was rehearsal. Looking back now, I realize that once Margaret established distance, she focused on something far more powerful than space. She focused on perception. At 28, I considered myself observant. I paid my own bills, managed deadlines, handled responsibility. Yet inside my father's house, I found myself second-guessing instincts I had trusted my whole life. That wasn't accidental. Margaret had a way of shaping conversations without ever seeming to control them. She asked questions that sounded harmless. "Do you remember how hard things were toward the end? Your father carried so much back then, didn't he? You were very busy during those years." Each question nudged the past in a particular direction, not rewriting it outright, just tilting it. And my father, eager for calm, began responding in ways that surprised me. "I suppose I did handle most of it," he said one evening. I looked at him, startled. That wasn't how I remembered it at all. Margaret smiled softly, as if pleased not with the answer, but with the shift. She also began involving herself in my father's practical matters, bills, appointments, paperwork. She framed it as support, and to be fair, he appreciated it. But soon, I noticed something unsettling. I was no longer included. If I asked about a decision, Margaret would reassure me, "Your father and I already talked it through." If I offered help, she'd say, "We don't want to burden you." Burden. The word stung more than it should have. I started visiting less, telling myself it was adulthood, independence, normal distance. But every visit left me feeling slightly smaller, slightly less certain of where I belonged. The house itself reflected that shift. Photos changed. Frames were rearranged. Pictures of my mother were moved from prominent places to shelves, then to hallways. Not removed, just relocated. Margaret noticed me noticing. "Oh, I didn't want to overwhelm the space," she said. "We're trying to keep things balanced. One afternoon, I stayed longer than usual, helping my dad clean the garage. Margaret brought us lemonade and lingered just long enough to comment. "It's nice seeing you help out," she said kindly. "You've been so busy with your own life." The implication hung there, unspoken. This house wasn't part of it anymore. The moment that unsettled me most came during a casual conversation about the future. Margaret mentioned downsizing someday, maybe moving closer to the coast. "You wouldn't mind, would you?" she asked lightly. "You have your own place now." I nodded automatically. But The words echoed uncomfortably. You have your own place now. As if that erased something fundamental. That evening, I called my father and asked if he'd been happy lately. It was an awkward question, but I needed to hear his voice without Margaret's influence. He hesitated. Margaret's helped me feel organized, he said carefully. Less pulled in different directions. I understood then that I was one of them. The distance wasn't just physical or emotional, it was narrative. Margaret was subtly redefining who mattered in the ongoing story of his life. Stability over history. Present order over shared past. And I was beginning to fade from the center. Still, I told myself I was being sensitive. That I was an adult and should accept change gracefully. That love didn't require constant presence. But doubt crept in during quiet moments. I started keeping note-states, conversations, phrases that repeated themselves. Not to accuse anyone. Just to reassure myself that what I felt wasn't imagined. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly if you're paying attention. Margaret never said I didn't belong. She didn't have to. By the time I realized how far I'd been edged out, I was already asking permission to occupy spaces that had once been mine without question. And somewhere beneath the politeness, beneath the careful smiles and reasonable explanations, I began to sense something deeper taking shape. A plan that didn't need confrontation, only time, only patience, and a will waiting quietly to be read. The strange thing about being pushed aside slowly is that you don't feel angry right away. You feel uncertain. I began questioning my own memories, replaying moments from my childhood as if they were unreliable witnesses. Had my father really carried everything alone? Had I been as absent as Margaret's questions implied? Doubt crept in quietly, making space where confidence used to live. That's when I started paying closer attention. Margaret had developed a new habit, bringing out old photo albums during calm afternoons, usually when my father was tired or reflective. She'd flip through the pages slowly, commenting just enough to guide the moment. "That was a difficult time for you," she'd say to him. "You look so stressed here. You didn't have much support then, did you?" My father would nod, thoughtful. Sometimes he'd say nothing at all. I watched, uneasy. The photos she lingered on always followed the same pattern. Images where my mother looked exhausted, ones where I was absent, moments frozen during arguments or hard seasons. Never the full story, only the fragments that suggested strain. When I pointed out happier memories, Margaret smiled kindly. "Oh yes, of course," she said, already turning the page, dismissed but politely. I began comparing those albums to the ones stored in the garage, the ones she rarely touched. There the tone was different. Laughter, crowded tables, holidays that felt warm instead of tense. Proof that our lives hadn't been defined solely by struggle. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while searching for a document in the study, I found a manila folder tucked behind a filing cabinet. Inside were loose photos and handwritten notes, dates circled, names underlined, phrases scribbled in the margins. It wasn't sentimental. It was analytical. Notes like, before transition, after stability, less interference. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. This wasn't casual reminiscing. It was curation. I realized then that Margaret wasn't just shaping memories, she was preparing them. building a version of the past that served a purpose I didn't fully understand yet. The realization left me unsettled, but I needed more than instinct. I needed clarity. I started documenting everything. When photos were moved, when conversations subtly shifted, when Margaret framed events in ways that minimized my role or exaggerated my absence, patterns emerged. My presence in my father's life was being reduced to visits, occasional support, peripheral involvement. Meanwhile, Margaret's role was steadily expanding: emotional anchor, organizer, stabilizer. She was becoming indispensable. The most chilling moment came unexpectedly. I found a photograph tucked into a drawer, one I didn't remember seeing before. It showed my father at a community event years ago, and in the background, partially out of focus, stood Margaret, years before she claimed to have met him. I stared at the date on the back. It was unmistakable. That night, sleep refused to come. Had she been watching from the edges long before she stepped into our lives? Had this been planned in stages: first proximity, then presence, then influence? The thought was deeply unsettling. I tried to speak to my father gently. I asked if he felt like certain memories were being emphasized more than others. He looked uncomfortable. "Margaret helps me make sense of things," he said. "It's not wrong to see the past clearly." Clearly, that word again. I realized then that confronting him directly would only push him further into her framing. The influence was already woven into his understanding of himself. Margaret noticed my withdrawal. "You seemed distant lately," she said one afternoon. "I hope you're not holding on to resentment." The accusation was subtle but present. "I'm just paying attention," I replied. She smiled. "That can be dangerous." She said it lightly, almost joking, but the warning landed heavy. By the time I returned home that night, one truth had settled firmly in my mind. Margaret wasn't erasing me from the past. She was repositioning me, and whatever future she was quietly preparing, it required me to be exactly where she'd placed me, on the margins, waiting for a will that would make it official. Once I accepted that Margaret was reshaping the past, the question that followed was impossible to ignore. Why? People don't invest this much patience without a reason. This wasn't insecurity or jealousy. It was too deliberate, too consistent. So I stopped reacting and started observing. I paid attention to timing. Margaret always revisited the past after conversations about the future: retirement plans, health concerns, finances. Memory, I realized, was her bridge between what had been and what she wanted next. One evening, after dinner, she brought up the subject casually. "Your father and I have been talking about simplifying things," she said, folding her napkin neatly. "Life is easier when responsibilities are clear." My father nodded. "We're not getting any younger." Margaret turned to me with a gentle smile. "Of course, you're independent. You've built your own life." There it was again. Independence framed as distance. Later that night, while my father slept, Margaret stayed up organizing paperwork at the dining table. I lingered nearby under the excuse of making tea. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You know," she said, "parents worry most about children who still need them." The statement sounded harmless, but it wasn't. It implied something else entirely, that those who didn't need were less deserving, less connected, less relevant. The next week, my father asked me to help him with some files. As we sorted through old documents, I noticed an envelope labeled Revisions. Inside were notes written in Margaret's handwriting. Not legal language, personal language, stability, consistency, primary support. Words that could be interpreted however someone wanted. That was when it finally clicked. Margaret wasn't planning to fight me openly. She was positioning herself to be seen as the natural, logical choice when decisions were made. Not through arguments, but through evidence, carefully curated memories, carefully framed involvement. She was building a case for why she and only she deserved control. I decided it was time to stop observing. I asked my father if we could talk alone. No schedules, no distractions. We sat in the living room, the same room where I'd done homework as a child. "Do you think I've been absent from your life?" I asked him directly. He hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "No, not absent, just busy." "Busy is different from gone," I said. He sighed. "Margaret says." I stopped him gently. "What do you remember?" That question unsettled him more than anything else I'd said. He rubbed his hands together, searching. "I remember you being there," he said slowly. "Helping, visiting, calling." Margaret's voice suddenly filled the doorway. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said calmly. "You are," I replied. She didn't flinch. I laid everything out then. The photos, the notes, the language she used repeatedly, the way certain memories were highlighted while others disappeared. "This isn't organization," I said. "It's narrative control." Margaret finally dropped the warmth. "I was protecting him," she said evenly. "The past was messy, emotional. People cling to versions that hold them back." "You mean we held him back?" I asked. She met my eyes. "You complicated things." My father stood up, shaken. "You made it sound like I was alone." She didn't deny it. "You felt alone," she said. I gave that feeling context. That was her confession. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. The room felt smaller after that. My father looked at me, his face full of something like grief, not just for the manipulation, but for how easily he'd accepted it. "I trusted you," he said to her. "And I used that trust to secure our future," she replied. Someone had to. The argument that followed was quiet but devastating. No shouting. Just truths finally spoken aloud. Margaret moved out within days. The paperwork was revised. Lawyers were consulted. Everything she'd quietly shaped had to be carefully undone. But the damage wasn't only legal, it was emotional. Trust, once cracked, never fits together the same way again. As I left the house that night, I understood something deeply unsettling. Margaret hadn't failed. She'd almost succeeded. And if I hadn't been paying attention, if I'd dismissed my instincts as immaturity or resentment, her version of our family would have been the only one left, standing, waiting, to be made permanent by ink and signatures. The house felt strangely unfamiliar after Margaret left, not because she'd taken much with her, but because her absence exposed how much space she'd quietly occupied. The routines she'd created collapsed almost immediately. Files were left untouched. Photos remained where they were, uncurated, unframed by explanation. For the first time in a long while, silence felt honest. My father didn't speak much in the days that followed. He moved through the house slowly, as if learning it again. Sometimes he would pause in a doorway or stare at a photograph and shake his head, as though trying to reconcile memory with realization. "I don't know how I let it happen," he said one evening. I sat across from him, careful not to rush the moment. "You trusted someone you loved," I said. "That's not a flaw. Rebuilding took time. Not dramatic time, quiet, ordinary time." We sorted documents together, corrected captions, put photographs back where they belonged. Some stayed in frames. Others returned to boxes. We stopped trying to present our lives as a single, polished story. Instead, we let them be what they were: complicated, shared, imperfect. The will was revised with clarity that left no room for interpretation. Language was stripped down to facts, dates, names, no emotional qualifiers, no assumptions about loyalty or closeness. When my father signed it, he exhaled deeply. "I don't want memory deciding what's fair," he said. That sentence stayed with me. Our relationship changed after that, not because love was lost, but because illusions were. We spoke more openly. When something felt uncomfortable, we named it. When memory felt uncertain, we admitted it. Uncertainty, I learned, is safer than false certainty. Weeks later, I ran into Margaret at a cafe. She looked composed, as always, calm, controlled. "I hope you're well," she said politely. "We're recovering," I replied. She studied me for a moment. "People remember what helps them move forward. People remember what they're shown," I said. She smiled faintly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, and then she left. I didn't feel victorious. There was no satisfaction in what had happened, only clarity. Manipulation doesn't always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives with structure, organization, and concern. It offers comfort in exchange for control and asks very little in return at first. Just acceptance, just silence, just trust. What I learned through all of this is something I wish more people talked about. Truth is fragile, not because it's weak, but because it relies on memory. And memory, left unguarded, can be shaped by whoever speaks the most gently. If you find yourself slowly questioning your place, your role, your history, pause. Ask why. Pay attention to patterns, not intentions. Because intentions can be explained away. Patterns can't. I didn't lose my place in my family, but I came close. And the cost of reclaiming it was the loss of someone I once believed meant well. Still, I'd make the same choice again. Because being treated like a guest isn't about manners. It's about erasure. And once you understand that, you learn something invaluable. Your history deserves protection. Even especially when someone else claims they're only trying to help.